Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is how it's schwer zu sein a Yid. It's not easy to be a Jew. This was the escutcheon of the Jews of Europe before the Holocaust, and following that, the Yiddish-speaking Jews of America. I heard it from my grandmother many times over. The expression, schwer zu sein a Yid, always followed by a big sigh. Actually, the title of a play written by Sholem Aleichem in 1920 was exactly that. The play premiered at the Second Avenue Theater almost exactly 100 years ago, on October 1st, 1920. It was revived again in 1949. Sholem Aleichem's work, surprisingly and ironically, was a comedy. It dealt with the relationship between a Jew and a non-Jewish environment. In this case, it was Russia. The play was part of a theme that developed in many of his works. The world of Sholem Aleichem and life in the shtetl in Russia is certainly a far cry from our lives today. But the poet, author, playwright was a visionary, and there are powerful messages in his work that are still relatable and still resonate in our Jewish lives today. Sholem Aleichem was a pseudonym. His parents named him Shlomo Nachum Rabinovich. He left Europe and moved to New York City in 1906. Returning to Europe, brought his family back with him in 1914. Sholem Aleichem is buried in Queens, New York. Over 100,000 people came to his funeral. It was the largest funeral in the history of New York City until that time. The most powerful of Sholem Aleichem's messages probably came from a series of stories, short stories, about Tevye the milkman.
Tradition!
It was those stories that later adapted into a hit play, blockbuster movie by Norman Jewison, that became the foundation of course, Fiddler on the Roof. In his work, Sholem Aleichem dissected an interaction between Jews and their host community.
Because of our traditions.
Outside community, Jewison renamed the true Sholem Aleichem's themes, Fiddler on the Roof. In Fiddler, we follow the breakdown of traditional society and family, illustrated by the way the marriages of the milkman's three daughters.
That I could get stuck for good.
The first daughter marries without aid or interference of a traditional matchmaker. The second chooses a revolutionary, still Jewish, but a revolutionary. The third daughter intermarries a nice Russian man.
It's just that I'm terrified. Matchmaker, plan me no plans. I'm in no rush. Maybe I've learned. Playing with matches, a girl can get burned. So bring me no ring, groom me no groom, find me no fine, catch me no cat, unless he's a matchless man.
The greatness of the Norman Jewison story and the Sholem Aleichem story touched even the Japanese. Japan had no idea who Tevye was and what life was like in the shtetl, and yet they related to the story. That was because it dealt with the breakdown of tradition. Japan is a very traditional society. It dealt with the encroaching and appealing and challenging ways of the modern world. All these years later, no matter where we live or how hard we try, there is no way to shut out the outside world. The Quakers can't do it. The Shakers can't do it, not in Pennsylvania or anywhere else. Neither can the Haredim of New York or Israel shut out the modern world. It is a reality that is brought home to us frightfully intensity in this pandemic called COVID-19. In the diaspora, as in Israel, Jews are trying to make sense of the pandemic and the restrictions it imposes on their daily lives and our rituals, especially as we observe the high holidays in Sukkot and other Jewish holidays. In the past, I would have used the word celebrate rather than observe. But this year, our celebrations are dimmed. They are muted both by the loss of human life of many families, and every community has suffered at the hands of the coronavirus, and because of lockdowns, more justly lock-ins or lock-aways, being imposed on us in efforts to stop the spread of the virus. The new year brings with it an end to one of the most difficult years we've ever experienced.
No. There is no other hand.
But Tevye was right. Tradition will triumph. We have tweaked our traditions this year, but we have maintained them. And we have crafted memories, many of which we never thought we ever would have to ever create. One thing hasn't changed. In fact, this year, it is intensified. The Jewish New Year is a time of introspection and self-knowledge. This year, we have so very much more to think about, given the restrictions and the way in which we celebrate. So much time to do that thinking, rather than embracing the restrictions and accepting that they are put in place to help conquer this assault on our health or our lives, on our economies, our educational systems, our livelihoods. Many people are fighting against them. That's wrong. It's deadly wrong. Sholem Aleichem took tragic situations and turned them into comedy. One day, hopefully, we will be able to do that too about COVID. Meanwhile, there's one story that's floating around. Many of its raconteurs swear that it's true. I hope it's not. I hope this is the beginning of our way of turning tragedy into comic relief. The story goes like this. A visitor walks into a synagogue. He looks around and sees that he's the only person wearing a face mask, the only compliant person in the room. He feels awkward and doesn't know what to do. Finally, he sees another man wearing a mask, sitting alone at the table in the corner in the back. At last he thinks, and he walks over to the table. He's about to sit down, and the man turns to the visitor and says, "So you have COVID also?" No one said it will be easy. Remember, schwer zu sein a Yid. As always, and as I always do, I've been thinking about history and about Israel and the Palestinians, and another often quoted phrase comes to mind. Abba Eban served in many governmental positions. In the early years after the creation of the State of Israel, Abba Eban was an eloquent, brilliant diplomat, an eloquent speaker, a gentleman, and a scholar. He served as both Israel's ambassador to the United States and the United Nations at the very same time when Israel was created. Abba even brilliantly observed that, and this is the quote, "Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity." His words and keen observation especially reverberate today. Palestinians were scheduled to chair the Arab League meetings for the next 6 months. The position rotates every half year from member to member. Instead of assuming the position, they resigned their chairmanship. They resigned because they, the Palestinians, had failed to convince the Arab League to condemn the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain for committing to peace treaties with Israel. The Palestinians claim that these treaties, created between the Jewish state and their fellow Arab nations, were an abandonment of the long-held agreement among Arab countries not to recognize Israel. Palestinian Foreign Minister Riyad al-Maliki held a news conference in the West Bank city of Ramallah to inform the Palestinian public and the world that they were resigning the chairmanship. He said, and I'm quoting here, "Palestine has decided to concede its right to chair the League's Council of Foreign Ministers at its current session. There is no honor in seeing Arabs rush towards normalization during its presidency." Unquote. Maliki then read from a letter he sent to the Arab League Secretary General Ahmed Abdul Gate, informing him of the Palestinian move and criticizing the UAE and Bahrain, both Gulf Arab nations. In his letter, Maliki wrote that peace deals with Israel, quote, "created a deep crisis in the Arab League," unquote. Obviously, in the year 2020, the Palestinians stand almost alone in their thinking. It was typical Palestinian response, though. Hurt themselves in hope that by hurting themselves, people will take notice, that people will feel your pain. It was a valiant, even if misguided effort by the Palestinians to, diplomatically speaking, diss Israel. They attempted to pass a resolution within the Arab League condemning the UAE and Bahrain's normalization agreements with Israel, and they failed. When Gulf states gained the support of the Arab League because of the treaties they signed, the Palestinians were dealt a huge blow. Instead of moving on, they took a big and very predictable step backwards. For years, the Palestinians thought that they could set the tone for all Arab interaction with Israel. They have not succeeded anymore. They have now not learned their lesson either. The Palestinians claim that they cannot participate in a movement to normalize relations with Israel until the agreement is in place. It's wrong. That process is creating an agreement is called normalization, but they have rejected and continue to reject the process. They say that they will not participate in a process that causes their own destruction. They say that the Arab League's support for normalization is akin to Palestinian suicide. That explains the reasoning behind the resignation of the Arab League chairmanship. What the Palestinians do not understand is that through the position of chair, they could bring important attention to their story. and agenda could be made clear, even help the process of normalization, guiding it. The Arab League is composed of a hefty 22 nations. Instead, they identified it as a loss and walked away. But Palestinian leadership cannot be swayed. Even money has not persuaded the PA to budge from their childish stance. And large parts of the Arab world, including 7 Gulf states, are throwing up their hands in despair over the behavior and decision-making process of the Palestinian leadership. Gulf money donations to the Palestinians has virtually dried up because of this. In the first 7 months of 2019, PA received $267 million in donations. This year, 2020, that number shrunk to 38, a drop of 80%. If $230 million could not sway and influence the Palestinian leadership's attitude, I do not know what will. The UAE UN's ambassador met with Israeli UN ambassador recently. Her name is Lana Nusseibeh. She is a woman of Palestinian descent, educated in England with a master's degree in Jewish and Israeli diaspora affairs. Nusseibeh is from a prestigious Palestinian family. Decades ago, her father fell out of favor with the Palestinian leadership over their direction. The Arab world is leaving the Palestinians to flounder on their own. Arab nations are forming alliances with Israel on almost every level, politically, economically, and even in the world of great equalizers, sports. Dubai has just signed their Israeli soccer player, Dia Saba, to play for the UAE professional soccer team. Abu Ima also said that, quote, nations act wisely once they've exhausted all other alternatives. This is the nature of normalization. Palestinians are missing great opportunities here. Coming up next, points of view. First up is an editorial from the Times of Israel. It was published on September 27th, on the eve of Yom Kippur. It's penned by Yehuda Mirsky. Rabbi Mirsky is a professor at Brandeis University. He's a professor of Near Eastern and Judaic Studies and is the author of Rav Kook, Mystic in the Time of Revolution. He served in the Clinton administration as special advisor in the United States State Department, Human Rights Bureau. He studied at Yeshivat Har Etzion and Yeshiva College, received a rabbinic ordination in Jerusalem. Full disclosure, I must tell you, Yehuda is my brother-in-law. He is also one of the most impressive thinkers in the Jewish world. As a writer, it is truly a pleasure to read his insight. This column is entitled, On Yom Kippur, What If We Can't Forgive Our Enemies? It's subtitled. At this time of rage and rancor, it's hard not to hate, truly hate, those whom we oppose. Can we just let ourselves off the hook this year? The point of his piece is that hate is an emotion that eats away at your soul. Instead of hating, try to understand the people you disagree with and make certain that they are human in your own eyes. He is speaking about political enemies, not physical enemies. This is how the column begins. Let's face it, not many of us are in a forgiving mood these days. Before COVID, before the murder of George Floyd, before whatever outrage has kept you up at night the last few days, just when you thought things couldn't get hairier, the last years have been, among other things, one long offensive against the reserves of patience, compassion, perspective deep inside us that enable us somehow to forgive. The coming home to roost of problems long avoided, structural racism, the effects of deindustrialization on the working class, dysfunctional health system, climate change, the efforts of bad actors, plutocrats, tribalists, white supremacists, and Antifas and their fellow travelers, illiberal forces left and right, have been made even worse by cultural rot, blurring the lines between politics and entertainment. And anger drives clicks. If the devil has a business model, this is what it looks like. Now Mirsky gives context, explaining how different this new world is from the past, from our past world. He writes, and this is important, writers, artists, therapists have for decades explored the difficulty of coming to terms with and forgiving those who've hurt us in our personal lives. And yet that seems today the easier part. Forgiving parents, siblings, spouses, and friends can be hard, but pales next to forgiving one's enemies, not just personal ones, but groups, movements, institutions that seem bent on not just countering, but actively destroying what we see as the common ground. Forgiving one's enemies, not after their defeat, but in mid-fight, here and now. Why even should we want to forgive our enemies when they have made or been manipulated into their choices because of what hating them does to us, to me, to you. Because hate, let's face it, it's hard not to hate these days, makes us agents of destruction when what we most need to do is somehow build. Mirsky explains that it's important to understand how other people see the world, especially the people we disagree with. He writes, and one more thing, people disagree with one another for all kinds of reasons, but especially in free and open societies and in social circles where people can speak their minds. One reason is that we haven't done a good job of explaining ourselves, our values, our interests, and concerns. Living in freedom challenges us to speak our opponents and open ourselves to speak to them. We may not change each other's minds, but at least we can learn to understand how one another see the world and hopefully appreciate one another's good faith. We can't let ourselves off the hook. Mirsky now concludes by writing that what is appropriate on Yom Kippur is also appropriate for any time all year round. And I quote, this Yom Kippur finds us in social, political, and ideological battles that for many, many of us are truly the fights of our lives. In COVID, the social, political, and ideological battles have become battles of public health. This global pandemic drives home that in the end, the human condition, we need to pray for the best to emerge not only from ourselves, but from our enemies too, because we are all in this together. Next up is a column from the Atlanta Jewish Times. It was published on August 10th and is written by David Schechter. It's entitled, What is Jewish Privilege? It's complicated. It's subtitled, As when he asked, Are Jews white? Dave finds no easy answer on the issue of Jewish privilege. Schechter begins with a Dvar Torah. He writes, the Torah portion of Etchanan in Deuteronomy 3:23, which was read last week. This column was written, outlines the terms of God's covenant with the Jewish people and why Jews are chosen to be a people belonging exclusively to God, more than all other peoples that are upon the earth. Think of it as the original statement of Jewish privilege. That hashtag appeared on Twitter in early July, prompting postings of anti-Jewish sentiment and conspiracy theories. Jews control the media, banks, politicians, and are behind the plot to fill in the blank. For a time, Jewish privilege was trending, which meant it was a hot topic. Schechter shows just how crazy the conversation has become. He continues, and I'm quoting, much of the current Jewish privilege debate centers on racial identity. Along those lines, I remain astonished that a column I wrote in December 2016 titled, Are Jews White? It's Complicated, was the most viewed item on the Atlanta Jewish Times website in July. A Google search for Are Jews White found that the column listed on the first page 25,600 results. Schechter concludes by explaining how it is all so complicated. Louis Frank, long active in the Jewish and wider Atlanta community, took a different tact. It is not a public or social privilege. It is a personal gift. If one can accept it by accident of birth, it offers a legacy of values, culture, community, tradition, discipline, laws, and customs that are brilliant in their understanding of human nature. What we choose to accept and yoke ourselves with is one issue. What prejudice others bring to the perceptions of us is another, Frank said. So are Jews privileged? It's complicated. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 3 cartoons today. The first cartoon is a play on Zoom education and the strictures imposed on us by the coronavirus, limitations that we have to have, and just how bad things have gotten. The sign reads, education is important, but opening the pub is importanter. I have no doubt that people are missing their comfort places and their releases. For many, their pub is like their living room. Next up is a series of caricatures of 6 people. The title is What Face Masks Say About a Person. The first is clearly a health professional. The second looks nearly appropriately dressed, is a semi-professional. 3 has a scarf around her face and is thrifty. 4 has a creative mask and is handy with a needle. 5, the cartoon came from the cartoon world and is a bank robber. 6 is wearing his underwear on his head, and it reads, shouldn't be allowed out of the house. The last cartoon pokes fun at Antifa, BLM, and their aggressive protests, during which they abuse patrons at outdoor restaurants. The The couple is asking the restaurant hostess for a table for two and then asks, is there a no hectoring section? In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. The Middle East is changing so quickly and in so many ways. As I said earlier, Dubai signed Dia Saba, an Israeli soccer player, for a 3-year contract, $3 million. He will play for the UAE. Saba currently plays for the Chinese club. He has played for them for 3.5 years. He still plays for the Israeli national and international team when they compete internationally. Before signing for China, Saba played for the Israeli team Hapoel Beersheva.
סאבו, מאבד את זה לקלאזר. הנה דיה סבא, ינסה להעניש מרחוק. הנה העונש! הנה העונש! דיה סבא! מספר 22 שלו העונה! ומהיפים שראינו! מכבי נתניה 2, בית"ר ירושלים 0.
The significance of this soccer deal is that sports is the ultimate equalizer. That's what I said earlier. In the Middle East, soccer is almost more popular than God. This move shows just how easy it is to normalize relations. Honduras announced that they will be opening an embassy in Jerusalem by the end of the year. The announcement came on Twitter, on the Twitter account of the Honduran president. President Hernandez wrote, and I'm quoting, to strengthen our strategic alliance, we spoke to arrange the opening of embassies in Tegucigalpa and Jerusalem, respectively. He continued, we hope to take this historic step before the end of the year, as long as the pandemic allows it. This announcement follows announcements 1 week earlier by both Serbia and Kosovo about their hope to open embassies in Jerusalem. A good number of other countries have announced their intention to move their embassies to Jerusalem. They include Brazil, Hungary, Moldova, and Romania. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now to know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. I spoke a little bit about Sholem Aleichem and Yiddish. Once upon a time, Yiddish was the language of the Jewish community of the United States. Lower East Side was teeming with Yiddish culture. Judging by newspapers alone, there were at least 11 daily newspapers printed every day on the Lower East Side of New York City. That's not to mention weeklies that came out, of which there were dozens and dozens of weeklies. Believe it or not, the largest distributed and read paper in the country was not the New York Times, but was the Jewish Forward. It was the Forward that created the letters to the editor section totally. They called it the Bintel Brief. They were the first newspaper that created an advice column, and that took off and spawned columns like Dear Abby. But it wasn't just the Forward. There was the Morgan Journal. There was Der Tag. There was the Morgan Freiheit. And these were just the dailies. You can't imagine the type of culture that existed. Theater, think about it. Live theater was all over the Lower East Side. Yiddish Theater District, also known as the Jewish Rialto, or the Yiddish Rialto, was the center of New York City's Yiddish theater scene in the early 20th century. It was located primarily on 2nd Avenue, though it extended to Avenue B between Houston and East 14th Street in the East Village in Manhattan. The district hosted performances in Yiddish of Jewish, Shakespearean, classic, and original plays, comedies, operettas, dramas, as well as vaudeville and burlesque, and musical shows. By World War I, the Yiddish Theater District was cited by theater critics and journalists in English papers, in American papers, like Lincoln Stevens, Norman Hapgood. They touted Yiddish theater as the best theater in the city. It was leading Yiddish theater district of the world. The district's theaters hosted as many as 20 to 30 shows every single night. During that time, it wasn't Shrebetzana Yid in the Yiddish world, at least. Yiddish culture set the stage for the development of American culture throughout the entire United States. That was unbelievable. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.